Welcome to this episode of Tata Katha, where we have Dr. Shashank Shah, the renowned author of the book The Tata Group. Hi, Shashank.
Hello.
So we are pleased to have you today, and we would like to discuss on the global aspirations of the Tata Group. If I recall correctly, somewhere in the early 1990s, when Mr. Ratan Tata took over, that time the Tatas were an India-focused group largely. So while as they were into exports, but the focus was on the main Indian market. Over the years, we have seen Tata is acquiring multiple companies overseas, be it with Tetley, Jaguar-Land Rover, or even Chorus Steel. So, do you think that Mr. Ratan Tata mandated global acquisitions for all organizations? And if so, why have some companies stayed behind and others have gone ahead? And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is a common impression that Mr. Tata, after taking over as the chairman in 1991 from JRD, issued a diktat for globalization. I had asked this question to Mr. Ishaq Hussain, who was then the group CFO at Tata Sons. And he had worked closely, I'd mentioned this in one of the previous episodes also, with the JRD and also with Mr. Ratan Tata, especially during the years when the Tata Group was extremely proactive with the M&As. So he shared with me that Mr. Tata's main point with respect to globalization was, or rather with respect to looking for global opportunities for Tata companies, was that since the world itself was globalizing, the group, the Tata Group and all its companies and its businesses should be looking at themselves in a global context. As you rightly said, the Tata had indulged in some form of international business for long decades. It was also one of the key terms on Ratan Tata's strategic plan for the Tata Group, which if you would recollect, he had drawn up immediately after taking over as chairman of Tata Industries in the early 1980s, and when he was nominated as group vice chairman. But his proposal did not get much encouragement from the board of Tata Sons in those years, as he has himself acknowledged on several platforms. And hence his whole vision with respect to going global saw the light of day only after he took charge. And post 91, that's of course fortuitously also the time when Indian economy opened up, which was in 1991, the liberalization, privatization, and globalization, as it is called. That was the year in which he took over as chairman of the group. And so he encouraged a lot of Tata companies to source materials from the most economic source and also look at supply chains in a global context and sell products by expanding the existing scope of the market. Today, these things would look obvious, global supply chains and sourcing from different countries where the price is most competitive and selling products beyond the obvious geographic boundaries. But that was not as commonplace, or rather it wasn't commonplace at all in those years. The millennials and all the current day entrepreneurs and startup captains would be surprised to know that making overseas investments or selling one's products overseas or trying to get some foreign exchange for use in your international transactions, etc., was a very, very big issue which had to be undertaken with special permissions from the Reserve Bank of India and several authorities. So at that time, these things were Mr. Tata's vision. And he believed that if a Tata company had the managerial capabilities and if they could find the finance, the Tata companies were free to buy a good overseas asset. It's important to remember that the Tata companies are a board-driven ecosystem. They don't take instructions from Tata Sons, so to say. While most of the chairmen are nominated by Tata Sons, but they do have their own independent board of directors who are free to have their independent opinions. And we've seen that on several occasions. And so if the Tata companies believe that there is something that they could explore overseas, Mr. Ratan Tata was open to that. In fact, if the Tata companies felt that India was the best location for their products, he was fine with that too, because he believed that if the group companies wanted to grow fast, then probably they would have to explore global opportunities. He was very convinced of that. But he was also flexible for companies that were confident of growing in India, especially when India had phenomenal number of obstacles for doing business. Here we are talking about the 1990s. For example, as I said, there were so many restrictions in those years. When Tata Tea acquired Tetley around 99-2000, it was the first cross-border acquisition by an Indian group. And at that time, remittances by Indian companies were restricted to certain times the company's net worth, and the rest of the amount had to be borrowed locally. And so every company, or Tata Katha in this case, had to focus on structuring the transaction, looking at tax implications, compliance with FERA, which has now become FEMA, and special approvals from the Reserve Bank of India. All of these were a long list of requirements before they could go ahead and acquire a company. And a year later, when the transaction was actually completed, and it was purchased for about 2,750 crores, the Tata Tea's acquisition of Tetley in UK emerged as the largest cross-border acquisition of an international brand by India until then. But it was also the first instance of an Indian company resorting to a leveraged buyout, the LBOs as they are called, to acquire an entity much larger than its own size. So these are things which are very commonplace today. These are things which are discussed all the time. But if you look back, it's just, it was 20 years ago when the first LBO was executed from India. So it's not that long back, and it was quite a feat in those years. And hence, to look ahead of his time, and suggest some of these things was a big leap forward for the group. And 2 decades later today, things are much easier. India has risen several ranks higher in the ease of doing business, as we all know. The Prime Minister keeps talking about it. And we've also been, over the last decade and more, highly successful in emerging as among the top FDI and FII destinations in the world. So that's a contrast which I would like to draw as to the mandate with respect to globalization. But here I'd like to also give an example of a Tata company which did not venture to go global and did extremely well even when it operated only in the Indian markets. And here I'm talking about Voltas, the consumer durables company. After a lot of internal discussions, the Voltas board was convinced that the company did not have the managerial capabilities and the finances at that point in time to go abroad. However, it had a very strong brand, and the product in India was highly appreciated. So it stuck to the Indian markets, but it focused on global sourcing. And at that time, it was sourcing as much as 60% from China. So in case of Voltas, globalization was not about taking your products and brands overseas or acquiring overseas brands and products, but sourcing overseas, global sourcing. So it was globalization of a different kind. And the supply chain became global. And a decade later, Voltas emerged as India's market leader in room air conditioners, with an annual sale of about 10 lakh air conditioners and over 20% market share. And it defeated, so to say, the biggies from South Korea, which is Samsung and LG. And interestingly, with only 4% of the Indian households having air conditioners compared to 70% of China, in China, there's a huge scope for growth. So from that perspective, Voltas's decision to focus on the Indian markets and emerge as the market leader and be a popular brand locally has given very good results. So I think if we can just highlight the global strategy that was adopted by the Tatas in the 1990s, there are three key aspects which emerge. One was, of course, as I said, accessing material and financial and human resources from the best and the most competitive parts of the globe. Second would be acquiring customers and accessing markets which constitute a future profitable growth from anywhere in the world. And third was connecting these two through best-in-class processes and facilities to create great value for customers by leveraging global supply chain, suppliers, partners, and locations. And all of this under Mr. Ratan Tata's chairmanship yielded phenomenal success. I mean, if you look at the decade post 2000, Tata Group acquired over 36 global corporations and invested nearly $30 billion in their international acquisitions. And the contrast is very obvious. Before it began its journey, their group earnings were about 9 billion. And within 10 years, their net revenues increased 8 times to about 70 billion, of which about 57% came from overseas. When Mr. Ratan Tata stepped down as a chairman in 2012, 57% of Tata Group's earnings were from overseas. And eventually it's increased by 10 more percent, about 65 to 67% of the group revenues today come from overseas. When he stepped down, Tatas were present in about 80 countries. Today, Tatas are present in about 100 countries, and the products and services are available in about 150 countries. So that's the kind of transition and change that we've seen in the Ratan Tata era. And there are different models in different companies that are followed, and some did well, some didn't do well. But yeah, to answer your question, there was no diktat as such. There was a kind of a broad priority identified by the group chairman, and each company taking its own decision. Somewhere Mr. Ratan Tata was very proactive, like Tata Motors or Tata Steel. He led from the front. In other cases, he let the companies take the call.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Shashank. I think the example that you gave of the Tetley acquisition, I think that was anchored by Rabobank at that point of time.
Right.
And I still remember that LBO being quite a unique thing in India as far as financial structuring of a transaction is concerned. One of the other advantages of a global aspiration or global strategy, which I feel is that, one is able to offset business cycles of one geography with another, and more so with multi-industry presence which the Tatas have. Again, it works the same way. You are able to offset the performance of one industry in one geography with perhaps sterling performance of another industry in another geography. And also a global presence helps in more than anything else in accessing global finance, which is also able to propel growth. Yeah, so I think on that, the Tatas were pretty aggressive. However, having said that,
yeah,
I
I'll just add a point there, Girish, with the point of global finance. Sometimes it doesn't work as easily as we thought, as we think. For example, during Tata Motors acquisition of JLR,
yes,
the 2008 crisis set in, and none of the international banks were willing to lend money to Tata Motors. And at that, State Bank of India-led consortium had given money to Tata Motors for the acquisition. So
right.
it is your own people who come to your rescue with your global aspirations. So it's not that always global money has been used for global acquisitions. In this case of Tata Motors acquisition of JLR.
All right. But I also think, Shashank, that, certain companies in India which could possibly have gone global. And since I am from the agribusiness sector, one name that coming to my mind reasonably regularly is that of Rallis. So it has continued being, so it has done well in India, but it has continued being largely within India. Of course, they do have some presence, a little bit in Southeast Asia and a little bit in a few African markets. But it has perhaps not done as well as it could have done as compared to its other peers from the Indian industry itself. And one of the other concerns also, Shashank, was that since the Tatas are known and they have a sterling reputation for their culture and ethos, one was not very sure whether the Tatas will be able to sustain these ethos and values while competing with the multinationals, either globally or within India. However, what one can observe is that not only has the group abided by its core values, it has also been able to integrate the companies that it has acquired into those values and into that culture. And therefore, what is your take in terms of what is the unique thing that the Tatas bring to their mergers and acquisitions when it comes to integrating a company culturally into the Tata ethos?
Yeah, so I think I'll go back to my book on the Tata Group, and I'd encourage the listeners to look it up. I've covered the entire globalization journey of leading Tata Group companies, Tata Steel, Tata Motors, Tata Global Beverages, Tata Chemicals, and Indian Hotels, and several others. And what were the, I mean, it's the entire trajectory of at what point in time global aspirations entered, how they actually identified the right acquiring, and the right entity which needs to be acquired, arranging for the finances, the manpower, etc. And it's very fascinating how at every stage, to a large extent, Tatas have abided by their code of conduct and the values and the ethos which they've held quite dear. And there are three things that I identify in my book which have emerged as a distinct approach which Tatas followed for their overseas acquisitions. So I'll give some examples in each of the contexts so that the viewers are able to better appreciate what I'm saying. So one area which is very evident is national integration. There are three kinds of integrations that they facilitated during their acquisition. So one is a national integration. In the decade between 2000 and 2010, there are three major acquisitions which the Tata Group ventured into. One was the Tata Tea's acquisition of Tetley. One was Tata Steel's acquisition of Chorus, and one was Tata Motors' acquisition of Jaguar-Land Rover. And incidentally, all of these three were in the United Kingdom. And as a result, Tata's became UK's biggest manufacturer and largest employer, a private sector employer, with 40,000 employees, just ahead of British Aerospace. And if one were to add TCS at that time, Tatas were employing 45,000 people in Great Britain in around 2010. So that was a huge footprint in that particular country. And at that time, the Brits mainly feared that Tatas would strip out the technology in the companies they've acquired and ship it home, and even lay off workers in thousands by transferring production to low-cost locations in India. But none of that happened. Contrary to all their conjectures, Tatas not only retained the original names and brands like Jaguar and Land Rover, which are heritage British brands. And the Brits have a lot of self-respect with respect to these brands, because even the royal family, the Queen herself uses Jaguar and Land Rover vehicles. So there is a lot of sentiment associated with these brands. So the Tatas did not change the brands or transfer locations. In fact, they added employees. The number of people working in the workforce was added in those years. For example, the workforce at the plant where JLR's Evoque model was manufactured was doubled to 3,000 within 2 years of acquisition. So the fears with respect to their nations losing out on livelihoods, their nations losing out on a sense of pride with respect to those brands, their nations losing out on the technology which those companies have worked and developed on over long years, all of that the concerns were laid to rest, so to say. And these prestigious brands, as I said, Jaguar, Land Rover, Tetley, all of them were sold as premium brands in India and other parts of the world, alongside Tata Motors and Tata Tea products. So they, so to say, integrated these brands into their portfolio while retaining their original heritage. And they projected an image of a professionally run conglomerate without any nationalistic overtones. There was a feeling that because we were the colonized country for over 150 years, and these were companies of the colonizers, we would hit back and try and so to say, take sweet revenge. But that was never the mindset which was displayed by the Tatas. The group ran the acquired companies on sound business principles. There was no prejudice in the name of patriotism. And thereby they did something very unique. They displayed India's culture and business principles, which were reflected through their approach to integration, unlike the Western approach, which was very cut and dry and which was extremely commercial and commercial oriented. So that is one area, integration from a nation's perspective, ensuring the sentiments of the host country. The second is the community integration. Ratan Tata's constant message across Tata companies was to contribute to the countries in which the Tata companies were expanding, and to ensure that they enjoyed the same degree of trust that the Tatas did in India. In fact, their philosophy was to be seen as a local company in that geography, and by keeping mostly a local management and employees, and to augment and support them. The Tata company could thus connect with the host country's society and environment in cultural terms, but also in political terms, because you are seen as a company which is not trying to be an Indian company in China, or an Indian company in UK, or an Indian company in Africa or USA, but you're trying to be a local company competing with the local priorities as a foremost concern, rather than the your country's priorities in that particular geography. So one of the key distinctions of the Tata Group, which convinced the countries and the communities where they had acquired businesses, was demonstrated through this long-term commitment of the interests of the acquired company and its people. This was unlike the previous investors of those companies. As I said, most of these investors, even in case of JLR, as I've covered in my book, were private equity investors. In case of Tetley, they were private equity investors. They, despite belonging to that geography, to the native country, were primarily focused on milking their investment and gaining short-term profits. But with the Tatas, their focus was strategic long-term investment. And their strategy in the acquired companies moved from a typical quarter-to-quarter outlook to a vision for the next 5 to 10 years. And if that meant acquiring new land, like they did with respect to Daewoo's commercial division, which they acquired in South Korea, where they acquired new land and expanded their footprint. Or as I mentioned, in case of JLR, where they employed more number of people, they doubled the employers in a particular plant. And here, I'd like to go back in time, where in the 1960s, Tata International and Tata Exports were formed to export Tata products and services to the international markets. Long decades prior to that, Tatas were actually known as a trading house in the late 1800s, and they had presence in several places. Jamsetji himself had visited a lot of those places on behalf of Tata Sons in order to strengthen their trading relationships in those geographies. And in the 1960s, the Tatas once again revived that. Osaka, Kobe, Shanghai, New York, Paris, and these were the offices where these are the places where Tatas had offices almost half a century prior to that. But under the renewed international outreach, Tatas ventured into newer geographies, precision equipment in Singapore, or a palm oil refining in Malaysia, or the hospitality and electricals business in the Gulf countries. All of these were newer areas they ventured into on the international stage. In this context, I had a conversation with Mr. Shyamal Gupta, who had served the Tatas for almost 45 plus years. He was a director at Tata Sons. And he recalled the success of the telco, which was erstwhile Tata Motors, their trucks in Africa. In an environment where European products were popular, Tata's endeavors convinced local consumers of the quality of Indian products. And such was the impression created in the local consumers in major African nations that several Indian companies who came thereafter benefited from the positive image that Tatas had created. And at that time, Mr. Suman Gumulgaonkar, who was the chairman of Tata Motors, had given clear instructions to Mr. Shyamal Gupta, who was heading the international operations of Tata Motors. He had told him, be part of the local economy. Don't focus on bringing money back to India. That's a very unique approach. Usually, the objective of most multinationals is to bring a lot of money back to their own country. But here is an approach way back, almost 60 years back, where the chairman of the company is saying that you focus on developing the local economy and community. Don't worry about bringing money back to India, which is quite counterintuitive to the way businesses would think when they go for international operations. And that has continued in recent times. In whichever geographies they have invested in, they have not just exploited commercial opportunities. Of course, they should, but they've also played a developmental role in that country. For example, Tata Chemicals, through the Magadi Foundation in Kenya, they invest almost 100 crores every year for the benefit of 30,000 community members. For example, TCS in USA, where it has emerged as among the top IT companies, they've invested almost $3 billion in employment in nationwide STEM education programs in academic partnerships and creation of endowments in different states of USA. So that's the kind of focus they've had with respect to integrating with the host community, society, and contributing to the local economy, which is not a recent practice, but that's why I gave these examples for almost 60 plus years, whether it is Africa or America, UK or Asia, whichever country they've entered into, they have attempted to integrate well with the community. And the last of the three is the employee integration, which is another unique aspect of the Tata's integration approach with respect to their global acquisitions, cultural and human integration. If you see across all their acquisitions, Tata's had initiated a customized integration program based on the unique circumstances and requirements of the company they acquired. For example, in Kenya itself, the Kenyans were very cautious when it came to the acquisition with respect to the Magadi soda company, which was acquired by Tata Chemicals. But the Tata Chemicals won them over. And I've covered in my book how when they brought the leadership of Magadi soda company to India and showed them their factories here and the way their employees believed about the commitment of Tata's to their well-being, it was about the famous phrase, they came, they saw, they were conquered. They were so bowled over by the kind of approach that Tata's had historically followed that they were far more willing to be a part of the Tata Group than they were earlier, because the Kenyans have not had a very pleasant experience with the companies that have worked, whether it is Indian companies or the British companies. So it comes from that historical fact and the kind of oppression that many of them have faced due to their commercial ventures in their geography. And even the case with the native Koreans, I've covered in my book how South Korea had very militant unions, and they were not willing to let any company acquire the Daewoo's commercial vehicles division. But again, the kind of interactions with Mr. Tata personally had with the shop floor workers and had lunch with them and spoke to them. And in fact, some of them asked Mr. Tata whether he would be willing to let them come to India and visit the Buddhist circuit. And Mr. Tata was more than happy to let that happen. And in fact, the South Koreans thought that probably Tatas were Buddhists and had that kind of a cultural alignment. So you see how these softer aspects play a very important role in giving commercial benefits, and Tata's leveraged it very well. Another example is of GCIP, General Chemicals and Industrial Products from Wyoming in USA, that was acquired by Tata Chemicals. Their senior leaders were surprised when Tata Chemicals asked them to stay back and steer the combined entity, because this was in stark contrast to the American way of M&A, where the old managements were typically terminated post an acquisition, which was kind of a sign of lack of faith in their capability to lead the company. In fact, most international acquisitions were judged by the speed with which old offices were closed and the employees packed off as a proof of effective decision making and a matter of pride for the acquiring company's senior leadership. But that was not the case with in which the way Tata has handled their acquisition. Compared to the GCIP way of direct and linear thinking that had resulted in a nimble and financially driven company, Tata's approach was spiral, and economics wasn't the only factor in the picture. The basis for all decisions that they were taking was for the overall well-being of the business rather than how much money they could make in the short term. So you see all the three areas, as I shared, employee integration, community integration, and national integration, do not come in the typical financial priorities which corporations look at during their international acquisitions. But in Tata's case, those were quite the priorities they looked at, and looking and addressing at those priorities gave them financial benefits, brand benefits, a larger and more confident, loyal market, and also a lot of prestige, so that whichever new geographies they went into for acquiring newer companies, the previous examples and experiences were quoted as a case in point as to how they dealt with their acquired companies. So The Economist had mentioned this very clearly. They said that they commended the Tata's approach. In my book, I have quoted this mention by The Economist, which is usually very critical of many of the emerging economies way of doing things. But in this case, probably because the acquired companies were in the developed world, I'm not sure the reason, but they praised the Tata approach, and they said that the Tatas did not believe in kill, cure, or sell philosophy, which many conglomerates like GE and its leaders such as Jack Welch followed. For example, in the 1980s, Jack Welch had earned the dubious moniker Neutron Jack because he was known for laying off employees while leaving the buildings intact. And the word neutron was a reference to the neutron bomb, which supposedly had a similar effect. But in the case of the Tatas, they believed in nation building, they believed in employment creation, they believed in technical skills training, not only in India, but in their global ventures as well. So this is, I think, a unique aspect with respect to the Tata's approach of global acquisitions, and the way they nourished these brands, the way they nurtured their talent, and the way they gave priority to the local companies, community, and nationalistic imperatives was something worthy of emulation and set a new bar with respect to the standards and benchmarks expected in the softer aspects of global acquisitions, and also in a way validated a conjecture that focusing on these softer and cultural aspects can have a substantial impact on the financial successes and the commercial benefits that a company can gain. So yeah,
Yes.
to your question, they not only prevented, or rather, they not only so when the globalization era came in, one of the biggest concerns of people in India was that the Tata model of doing business would not survive, which was far more stakeholder centric. And in order to compete with the Western companies, they'll have to compromise on some of the principles they've held very close to their heart for almost 120 years. But not only did they kind of manage the competition in India, beat the competition while aligning to their core values and priorities, but even in their global ventures, they extended these value systems and cultural primacies and won over the local companies and their communities and the local people by their value systems. So that's quite a big achievement, given that the capitalistic mindset has been extremely shareholder centric. It's only now that we talk about stakeholder capitalism, and the World Economic Forum has suggested as a way to achieve SDGs is stakeholder capitalism. But we are talking about quarter century back, when these were not the priorities of most companies and countries, and still with that approach, Tata succeeded to a reasonable extent.
Yes, Shashank, thank you so much for that. I think that was quite an exhaustive list of examples that you have given, and many of these have been covered in your book as well. But when we speak of global acquisitions, I don't think that all the acquisitions have panned out exactly the way they wanted them to be. In fact, one of Chandra's major concerns when he took over as chairman of Tata Sons was on Chorus. And therefore, basis the learnings which the Tatas have had, what do you think are the right lessons that other Indian business houses can draw from the Tata experience as far as overseas mergers and acquisitions are concerned? And what are your views on that?
Yeah, so I fully agree. All Tata globalization moves have been successful. Some have been successful, like Tata Global Beverages, which is now Tata Consumer Products, their acquisition of Tetley Tea, Tata Chemicals acquisition of companies in 3 continents, the Magadi Soda Company in Kenya, Brunner Mond in the UK, and the GCIP in USA. All of these, which made them the world's most geographically diversified company with a presence in 4 continents. Or these have been successful. For long years, Tata Motors acquisition of JLR was also considered quite successful. You'd recollect that despite the financial crisis, JLR turned around pretty fast, and they achieved a lot of success in newer markets like Russia and China. But in recent times, they've been quite under a shadow due to global recession and several factors affecting the automobile space. On the other hand, some of the acquisitions have not succeeded, like Tata Steel's acquisition of the British Dutch steel giant Chorus. I'm giving these connections so that some of the viewers who may not be aware of which country these companies were from, that's why I'm giving some of these details. Tata Chorus gave profits in the first year and phenomenal profits in the first year. But thereafter, the way the entire global geopolitical situation changed, the dumping from China, the excessive taxes by the European Union and UK environmental taxes on their native manufacturing companies. All of this played a very important role in killing the success of the Chorus acquisition. I've elaborated in great detail both the pros and cons. With respect to Chorus, there are very clearly divided groups. Some believe right from the beginning, even from within the Tata Group, that Chorus was a bad choice in terms of acquisition, or to go overseas was a bad choice. In contrast, there are a lot of people who believe that that was the best thing that they could do at that point in time, because they were not getting permissions in India to expand, and they had lost a decade waiting for permissions and the red tape, and they were not getting the kind of scale that they were looking at, and they had become a small player in the global steel industry. So for more information on that, I'd encourage the viewers to look into the Chorus chapter of my book. And Indian Hotels is another example where they didn't do well. Their international acquisitions. Mr. Raymond Bixson, in whose time a lot of international acquisitions were made, he used his expertise with his experience in the hospitality space across different continents in trying to get the right targets for Tatas or the Indian hotels in different countries, in Australia, in the UK, in the US, the Pierre in New York, the Taj Boston in Boston, the one in San Francisco, Campton Palace in San Francisco. All of these were acquisitions made at that time. But the Indian Hotels was not very successful. For example, Ritz-Carlton, who earlier owned what became Taj Boston, was able to sell rooms at an average rate of about $700 to $800 a night. But Taj wasn't able to get that rate post-acquisition. One of the reasons perhaps was that Taj was not that well-known a brand in the West. An American guest would probably stay at a Sheraton or a Marriott or a Hilton, but she may not try out a lesser brand like Taj, which was quintessentially an Asian brand, or better still, an Indian brand. On the other hand, Pierre in New York, under its earlier owner, Four Seasons, earned $800 a night for most of its rooms, but Taj was not able to get clientele at the same rate after acquiring Pierre from Four Seasons. So there were many such brand-related learnings for the Taj and Tatas during their global ventures in the hospitality space. In most cases, as I have analyzed, the group succeeded with globalization for branded products that had a global market, but not in enterprises that produced commodities. So that's where we see the success with branded products, both consumer products and like tea and beverages, and even for long years, automobiles. But for commodity products like steel, they did not have that kind of success. And its efforts to infuse cash and build and grow companies it acquired paid off in several cases, but did not in some cases. So, but on an average, I mean, if you look at all of them put together, nobody can deny that the group's ambition and achievement of transforming an Indian group of companies that had thrived for long decades in a protected environment could become a global giant within just a couple of decades. That was quite without a parallel in the emerging world. Samsung is perhaps the only other example that we can compare with in Asia. So there are two learnings, in my opinion, that emerge from the globalization journey for other Indian conglomerates. Of course, a lot of other companies have gone global. Birla Group has acquired a lot of companies overseas, and a lot of companies now have done a lot of overseas acquisitions because things have changed. Access to finance, regulatory regimes, the kind of support that the government gives, things have changed phenomenally. But in general, if one were to take learnings from Tata's globalization journey, there are two areas which I'd like to highlight. One was the way in which Tata companies leverage the Tata brand for facilitating these big moves. None of the individual companies, if they were standalone, would have been able to do it on their own without the Tata backing, because in terms of the finances required, the negotiations, or even building trust with executives of the acquired companies. These were strengths that they derived from their affiliation to the Tata Group: managerial strength, or technical strength, or financial strength, and even more important, reputational strength. In many cases, the Tata Sons overseas office was helping Tata companies with business development and external relations in the geographies where they were interested in acquiring companies as a team. So for the acquired company, it wasn't Tata Motors that was acquiring them or Tata Tea that was acquiring them. It was Tata Group that was acquiring them. And for all those reasons, a Tata brand and Bombay House was very critical in their global acquisition journey. When an emerging market company acquires a company in a developed economy, the top leaders typically move to work in other multinationals. But in the case of Tata's, because of the reputation and the experience in the past that they have given with their acquired companies, most of them stayed back, and that I think was a great validation of Tata Group's acceptance in that particular geography and their track record, which was appreciated by top business leaders in the developed world. So that I would say is a key learning. The second learning is, of course, different companies had different imperatives for going global, and some did well by balancing their focus on India and overseas. Some did only India. But it's important to note why Tata's went global. So I'd like to share a conversation which I had with a professor at Harvard Business School while I was a visiting scholar there. He had extensively studied the Tata Group for over 20 years. And he shared with me a conversation that he had with Ratan Tata after he had taken over as chairman. And his conversation was around the oft-asked question as to why the Tata Group is spending precious resources chasing markets outside when the rest of the world is wanting to leverage on opportunities that the Indian market has to provide. And Mr. Tata gave a very insightful answer. He said that if India was growing at 10%, the addressable space for Tata companies was about 6%, because the rest of the 4% were in areas where Tatas would have had to compromise on their values in order to do business, and they were not willing to do that. So effectively, they could focus only on 6%, and that was not a very commercially rewarding opportunity. So it was necessary that if it wanted to grow like its Indian counterparts, it had to grow abroad. This is a very unique insight which I think other companies should look at, that there is a balance of purpose along with the promise of commercial success. They were very clear why they were going overseas. They were not going overseas typically to make money. They were going overseas so that they could balance their purpose or their values or their ethos in India, and also want to grow at par with their peers and competitors in India. And so they felt that the commercial success overseas would be of great help. They not only continued, as I mentioned earlier, with their overarching vision of multi-stakeholder value creation in India, but they also extended this culture overseas. So the fact that it is possible to succeed while retaining one's core values and cultural primacies while operating in new global markets is possible is a key learning from Tata's experience. These are the two areas I thought I will emphasize. There are several financial, strategic, and technical learnings which I have highlighted in my book. In fact, each of the 6 chapters is like a case study. I have modeled it on the Harvard Business School case study style. So all aspects, the 360-degree overview to how each of those acquisitions were done, and the pre and post aspect of it, so that there are a lot of learnings. But I think these 2 points are really very important from the Tata way of doing things, and that's why I thought I should highlight them here. Very importantly, being balancing purpose with profits. I think in the current century, if corporations need to survive, this will be the mantra that will help them survive, succeed in a sustainable way.
Thank you so much, Shashank, for this wonderful session. I have always been very impressed with the very wide canvas that you cover and all these examples that you remember. And thank you so much for sharing them with us. Thank you, viewers, as well. Thank you for joining us for this session. And we shall be back soon with another episode of Tata Katha. Take care. Thank you.